Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for the ECHO Trial Results, WHO Perspectives. Thank you to all that have joined from around the world. We have over 500 people registered, and it looks like folks are still joining by the second. My name is Nandita Thate, and I will be facilitating today's panel. Next slide, please. This webinar is being organized in collaboration between the Department of Reproductive Health and Research at WHO and the IBP initiative. Next slide. The agenda for today's webinar is we will be covering several important topics related to the ECHO trial. First, we will start with a brief overview of the trial and WHO's process of revising guidelines. We will hear an update on engagement with various stakeholders and preparing countries with low HIV prevalence. We will then hear the status of preparedness in Southern and Eastern African countries. And finally, we will have an opportunity for some open discussion. Before we begin, next slide, I want to call your attention to the question box on your lower right-hand side of the screen. Please submit your questions during any of the presentations, and we will have some time for question and answer after all three presenters have presented. Also note that today's webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded on the WHO HRP YouTube site. You can also visit the website listed there below. With that, I would like to introduce our first panelist. Next slide. Dr. James Chiari. Dr. James Chiari is the coordinator for the WHO Human Reproduction Team at WHO. He is a qualified OBGYN, and prior to joining WHO, he was an associate professor in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Chiari, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nandita, and welcome everyone to this webinar. And I will just give a very brief overview of the ECHO trial and go into the process that WHO will follow in updating guidelines following announcement of the ECHO trial results. Next slide. Just maybe to introduce this issue, I know many of you have already attended webinars and seen presentations of the ECHO trial, but I think one of the things we have to remember is that at the core of the ECHO trial and many other studies on family planning is the importance of ensuring safety and effectiveness of contraception. And this is really very essential that we be able to understand and make sure that the methods that are in use are safe for the users. And for the last 25 years, we've had a lot of studies looking at this issue of the risk of HIV acquisition associated with use of hormonal contraception. The results have been mixed and they've not been very clear. And to date, most of the evidence that really looking at the issue of progesterone-only injectables, particularly DMPIM, which has been linked to an increased risk of HIV, but it's very unclear whether this association is causal, and also, as I've said, the results have been mixed. There is probably, although with limited data, less HIV risk associated with NETN that has been observed. We have absolutely no data on subcutaneous DMPA and very, very limited data on implants and non-hormonal IUDs. So even after all these 25 years of controversy, this is actually where we are. And on the next slide, as due to this mixture of results and lack of clarity, the current WHO guidelines recommends that women can use progesterone-only injectables, but should be advised about these concerns. and about the uncertainty about whether this relationship is causal or not, and they should also be advised on how to minimize their risk. As you can imagine, this is difficult to implement, and often it is difficult for providers and users and program managers really to make decisions when we are talking about concerns and there is very little clarity as to what is the real position. So on the next slide, because of this issue, that is why we have the evidence for contraceptive options and HIV outcomes echo trial. And this actually was one of the calls at the latest WHO guidance, is that there's need for randomized trials to address this issue. And the ECHO trial is a multi-center open label randomized clinical trial, is comparing HIV incidence and contraceptive benefits in women using IM, DMPA, levonorgestrel implants, and copper IUDs. And the slides I will present next, just about 3 slides, I'll be presenting them on behalf of the ECHO Consortium, who are various organizations, including WHO, that are implementing this study. The current status of the study is that it has enrolled 7,830 women, and this has been done in 12 sites in 4 countries, as can be shown on the map, in Kenya, Zambia, Eswatini, and South Africa. The follow-up visits were completed in October last year, and we expect that the study results will be announced in July this year. And what we are doing now is really preparing for the next step following the ECHO trial results. On the next slide, we just need to be very clear, and I think this is an area which we really need to reflect on as we think about the ECHO study, that the ECHO study will not address all the issues regarding contraception and HIV. It is not kind of the magic bullet that will end all this and provide all the knowledge, but it will provide some evidence. And we have to also realize that the ECHO study is adding evidence. It is not that the ECHO trial will have to be interpreted in the context of already a lot of research, as I've said, that has gone on in the last 25 years. What evidence will the study provide? One, it will be able to tell us the comparative HIV incidence in each group, comparing DMP and IUD implant versus DMPA versus implant. There are several ancillary studies embedded in the ECHO study, which will provide answers on possible biological mechanisms. And it will also be able to give us comparative side effects, continuation rates, and pregnancy rates in each of the groups. And this is what we are saying, that it will be able to give the risks and the benefits for HIV and pregnancy prevention between the 3 methods that are being studied. However, it will not be able to provide evidence on HIV incidence compared to no contraception. And really, this is very important because we'll only be able to compare between the methods. I think women do not have a choice of using a method or no method. They have choices between methods, and therefore will not be able to compare any one method to no contraception. It will also not be able to give comparative HIV incidence or all the other things, side effects or pregnancy rates, comparing to other methods that are not in the study. And there are very many methods, as all of you are aware, that are not included in this study because we have only have 3 methods in the study. So there is no oral contraceptives, NET10 is not included, DMPA subcutaneous, levonorgestrel implants, and progestin IUS. All these are not there. The study is powered to be able to detect a difference of about 35% in HIV risk between methods. So if there's a smaller difference, then the study may not be powered enough to detect that difference. And one of the things that the study will not tell us, and we have to look more broadly at other evidence, at modeling and other analysis, is what will be the impact of either policy, program, provider, or user level decisions on HIV incidence or unintended pregnancy. This is a randomized trial, is providing us with comparative HIV incidence in each of the groups, and we will need to look more broadly at all the evidence for us to be able to make policy, programmatic, provider level, and user level decisions. So that's just a brief overview on the ECHO study. I will not go into detail on the ECHO study. About 2 weeks ago, I believe, there was a very excellent webinar that was done by IBP in partnership with FP 2020, where there was very detailed presentation of the ECHO study. And those of you interested in hearing more, that webinar is available, is recorded, and you can listen to it and hear a detailed presentation of the methods and the design of the ECHO study. So I would like to move on the next slide, talk about updating WHO guidelines. As you know, for WHO, the guidance is a process which we take very seriously because we know that a lot of decisions are based on WHO guidelines. And on this question, it's very critical for us to get this correct at the beginning. And we have already started the process. First, we have what we call a guideline steering group. And a guideline steering group is an advisory group which advises WHO on all guidelines related to contraception. So it's not working specifically on HIV related guidelines, all guidelines. And basically what they do is advise us whether there is need to review a guideline or not based on the evidence. And the guideline steering group has already made a determination that with the ECHO results, there will be need to relook at the guidelines, irrespective of the results. And maybe the results will support the current guidelines. Maybe they look for it to be more relaxed. Maybe it will be very different. And I would like to emphasize at this point that we do not know the results. But the guideline steering group did look at the possible outcomes and say that it's important we start preparation advance of time. Following that, we then do a planning proposal, which is submitted to what is called the Guideline Review Committee. And the Guideline Review Committee is a WHO organ that is external to our department that reviews all WHO guidelines. So not contraception guidelines, all of them, whether they deal with malaria, child health, maternal health, communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, all guidelines issued by WHO have to be reviewed and approved by the Guideline Review Committee. And we have already submitted a planning proposal saying we want to review this guideline, and that planning proposal has already been approved by the GRC, as we call this committee. So that part is already done. As we await the ECHO trial results between now, between May and June, what will happen is that there will be a public announcement of the guideline development group. The guideline development group are the people who are external to WHO. It will include experts, affected populations, and other stakeholders who will look at this question and actually recommend and make recommendations on the guidelines. WHO requires that these members be announced so that people can comment in case there are conflicts of interest, and that it is an open process by which everybody is aware and who is advising WHO on these recommendations. So we hope that will be announced with a period of comment in May, June. The other thing we are doing is updating existing evidence on contraception and HIV, and also on values and preferences. So we know that the 2016 guidance, we had already done the review, but since then, there have been a few more studies that have come out, and we need to update the existing evidence so that when we get the ECHO trial results, it will be much easier to add that new evidence and have a comprehensive set of evidence that can be presented to the guideline development group. Then in July, we expect the ECHO results will be announced, and with announcement of the ECHO results, we'll issue a WHO statement on these results. And this statement is very important because the statement will provide direction on what should be done as we prepare the formal guidelines. It will also interpret the results in terms of what they mean for policy and for providers and for users. So this statement will be released at the same time as the results. And therefore, we should not have periods of uncertainty that there is no clear guidance from WHO. And following that, we'll update the evidence synthesis to include the ECHO results, and then hold the WHO GDG meeting in the same month that the ECHO trial results will be announced. And in August, we'll draft the revised guidelines. They will be reviewed by the guideline development group and approved, and then we'll submit them for approval by the guideline review committee. And our plan is to be able to release the approved guidance in August. So from the time of announcement of the ECHO results, in about 1 month, 1 month and a half, we'll be able to have approved guidance that countries can adapt and be able to cancel and provide the methods appropriately. So on the next slide, and this is my last slide, I think just following the revised guidelines, of course, then it goes to the process of actually implementing these guidelines in country. We will plan various regional and national workshops in September and October. We also have 2 big conferences, which will be also an opportunity for us to further disseminate the guidelines. This is in November, ICPD plus 25, and also ICASA in December. And of course, we'll also hold similar webinars like what we are holding now, following the issuance with guidance of the guidance to inform various stakeholders and to make sure as much as possible that this is disseminated and used in the countries. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. And I would just like to thank the various organizations that are providing funding to the ECHO trial. And this trial is dedicated to Ward Gates, who was with FHI, who really was the person who worked very tirelessly to make sure that this study is done. And I believe that it will go a long way in improving, in informing contraceptive safety for many users who are at risk of HIV infection. Thank you. And over to you, Nandita.
Great. Thank you, James, for that excellent overview of the ECHO trial and, importantly, steps WHO is taking in order to revise guidelines if needed. I just want to flag for our colleagues online that we have posted a link to the webinar with more details on the ECHO trial in the chat box, so feel free to view that at a later date. Now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Petra Stein. Dr. Stein is an OBGYN and scientist in the Department of Reproductive Health and Research at WHO and is the point person for several research projects, including the ECHO trial. He has more than 20 years of experience in family planning and contraceptive research. Dr. Stein, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nandita. So I will talk a little bit about the engagement processes and WHO's plans and actions. This is specifically related to preparing for these results. First of all, this is not the first webinar, and there will certainly be some more in preparation of the results. There is a UN working group of WHO with different WHO departments, UNFPA and UNAIDS, that have been looking and still preparing for these results. We have had country workshops last year, specifically in the 4 countries where the study is being done, and doing meetings and workshops there to help countries to start preparing for the results. Then we had over the past few years since the study start, we had almost an annual meeting, stakeholder meetings. The last one this year was in Lusaka in February, where we had about 120 people with 14 of the countries represented of high prevalence HIV in countries. And then we are also helping to set up in-country task teams through the Ministries of Health. So, as James mentioned before, we don't know the results, and there are different scenarios. There's quite a few scenarios, and which we are not going into detail in this webinar, but we are preparing for messaging for the different scenarios. To this extent, we have involved already quite a lot of stakeholders in these messaging. Our lead for communication for our own department is Kath Hamill, and she is at the moment in a meeting with the Family Planning 2020 and civil society group, sharing these messaging and getting input. I will post a link to a website that is specifically now for the ECHO results, and you can contact her directly on that. But after we have tested the messages, we will also put that made that available. Then I think James mentioned, as soon as the ECHO results is announced, then we will issue a statement which specifically look at the meaning of the results, the next steps, and the actions until the guidance review. I think you've seen that there's a rapid review of the evidence, including the ECHO results, which is already on busy with. And if needed, there will be some update of this results, and then dissemination of the results afterwards. Next slide, please. So there was a technical consultation this year in Lusaka, and that was really to look at the way forward and preparing for the results with a timeline. And what we are at the moment, where we are, is a webinar to follow up on the progress, and you will hear Dr. Nancy Kadula afterwards, later on, giving some updates. Next slide, please. So there are various stakeholders in this whole process. We are busy with in-country follow-ups on a weekly basis, and UNFPA is very closely involved here as well. I've mentioned the UN Working Group. There are also several other groups looking at preparation for this results, such as the funder group, the Family Planning 2020 AVAC group. There's some other implementing partners, and there's an operations group of the MPA subcutaneous as well. Next slide, please. So just to say something about preparing countries with lower HIV prevalence. We know that this study and the guidance is for women at high risk of HIV using hormonal contraceptives. So it is also important to have messaging for these countries with a low HIV prevalence, with a high use of injectables. And to this extent, we specifically in our messaging also involve Ethiopia, Senegal, India, and Nigeria in this. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Great. Great. Thank you, Petrus. That was very informative. And we will try to share that link in the chat as the webinar continues. Finally, I'd like to move on to our last panelist, Dr. Nancy Kadula. Dr. Kadula is a medical officer in reproductive and women's health at WHO, based in a regional office in Africa, in Harare, Zimbabwe. Dr. Kadula, over to you.
Thank you, Nandita. I would like to just present about the country preparedness for the ECHO trial release, mainly for Eastern Southern Africa, but a few comments about West and Central Africa as well. Next slide. We know that the Sub-Saharan Africa has very high unmet need as compared to other regions, and also very high, very low contraceptive prevalence rates, especially of modern contraceptives. Next slide. In addition, we find that East and Southern Africa is the region most affected by HIV in the world and home to the largest number of people living with HIV. Nonetheless, even the Western Central Africa region, we have very high mortality from HIV. Next slide. In all these countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, we find that the most popular contraceptive method is DMPA, as we all know. Use of implant is going up, and even the use of IUCD is improving, though at a much slower pace. Next slide. The WHO Eastern Southern Africa region houses all the 4 ECHO trial sites, that is the South Africa, Eswatini, Zambia, and Uganda, and Kenya. Next slide. And the results of the ECHO trial are therefore very important to the Africa region because of the high HIV prevalence rates and the high utilization of DMPA and increasing uptake of implants and IUD. Next slide, please. So in terms of methodology, after the Lusaka meeting, we actually shared the report of the Lusaka workshop and also shared with the countries the brief on the ECHO trial and many people participated in the webinar that Dr. Kiari talked about. We also shared with countries the possible scenarios to expect from ECHO so that they can base their discussion on those. And then the countries were actually expected to plan and to hold stakeholder workshops and carry on certain activities in the country to prepare for the ECHO trial results release based on a certain number of scenarios. Slide number 6. So we sent a questionnaire to the countries to assess the status of preparedness and for the period prior to the release, and also if they have any plans of what they will do after the release. And we got results from 16 out of the 20 East and Southern African countries, which we will share with you. I would like to say as a disclaimer that we have had activities that have gone on in countries since we made these slides, and therefore you may see that your country is showing red in the dashboard, but you have carried out the activity. But we will update these slides as we get information from the countries. Next slide, please. So in looking at country preparations, there are several milestones that countries were supposed to have reached by this time. They include having held a country stakeholder workshop and awareness creation on the ECHO trial, including the possible scenarios, having a task team established to oversee the actions prior to and after the release of the ECHO results, having a roadmap or a plan, previous slide please, a roadmap or a plan formulated for that, having policymakers updated, having sub-regional plans, etc. And in the previous slide, you would see that quite a lot of countries still haven't done that. But if we look at the priority countries that you can see on the slide, they have had the briefing with Ministry of Health and other stakeholders, and most of them have already convened a working group that is going to lead that process. The areas that are not doing so well are scenario planning, having subnational or regional plans, and also messaging and media preparation. Next slide. So if we look at the next slide, we will see the detail by the 16 ESA countries. We did not have any data from Comoros, Mauritius, Seychelles. We know a lot of work has gone on in Zambia, but we didn't have their detailed report. And from this, we see that the priority countries that were in the Lusaka meeting seem to be having quite a lot being done. There are countries that actually have had very little done. We do know that Tanzania has since had several activities, and Uganda as well. And basically, you can be able to track your country in this template. So next slide. So in general, we can say that many countries are not well prepared for the release of ECHO trial results. However, the priority countries and the ECHO trial sites seem to be doing much better in terms of preparation. Next slide. We then went to look at the service delivery readiness once the ECHO trial is released, and we see that countries are doing much, much better in terms of ensuring contraceptive commodity security and no stockouts, ensuring access to contraceptive methods, capacity strengthening of health workers, education and expansion of the method mix, policies for dual contraception, and policies for HIV counseling and testing for women seeking FP services in the country. So in this regard, I think the countries are doing quite well. The next slide will show us the detail of each of those elements by country, and we can see from that slide that almost the whole dashboard is green. There are a few countries that are lacking some policies, but most countries have service delivery readiness. So in terms of the readiness, most countries are implementing policies on HIV testing services. Next slide. HIV testing services and dual contraception. Family planning, education, and expansion of contraceptive method mix is ongoing, as is capacity strengthening and implementation of strategies to ensure access to FP methods. And countries are also making efforts to ensure contraceptive commodity security. Next slide. For Eastern Southern Africa, the countries noted some challenges, and that is generally a limited understanding of the potential impact of eco-trial findings, and therefore quite a number were hesitant to plan to do scenario-based planning. We already still have issues of stockouts of contraceptive commodities. Despite policies being in place, we have that. We have had the issues of diminishing external funding for FP programs, and that is affecting access and provision of family planning. And consequently, we found that in East and Southern Africa, only 3 countries actually had plans in place for actions between the period of ECO release and the updated WHO recommendation. Next slide, please. Looking at West and Central Africa, these 2 regions, they also have very low CPR and high unmet need. They also suffer stockouts. They also have issues of diminished funding. Even though the HIV prevalence is low in this country, we are seeing an increased incidence in the youth. Next slide, please. DMPA, not widely used except in some countries like Senegal and Nigeria. However, we have disseminated the WHO 2017 statement on hormonal contraceptives and high risk of HIV. And no country in these 2 sub-regions is part of the ECO trial, and most countries are not aware of the ECO trial and are not prepared for the results at all. So in conclusion, next slide, we need to put a little bit more effort in strengthening the country preparedness for the release of ECO study results, and to look at additional mechanism to fast-track this preparedness by countries. For West and Central Africa in particular, awareness raising about what is going on in terms of the ECO trial and other messages and statements that we already have needs to be done and fast-tracked so that they can also begin to prepare and be ready for the results and the WHO guidance that will be delivered after that. Thank you. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. That was an excellent perspective from the field on how WHO is preparing for the ECHO trial results, and clearly some additional work is needed. We'd now like to open it up for questions. Again, there's a question box on the lower right-hand screen, so if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in. We do have some already, so why don't we start? The first question regarding the study and HIV prevalence. James, perhaps this might be best suited for you. Has WHO decided what the threshold for risk is in high HIV prevalence countries. So how does WHO classify high HIV prevalence and risk, and what's that mean for the trial?
Thank you very much, Nandita, for that. Thank you very much, Nandita, for that question, and also for the participant who has raised this question. The issue of women at high risk of HIV has been one of the key questions that we've been getting. As you recall, in the previous guideline, this issue was discussed, and the guideline development group at that time felt that it would be improper to define a specific threshold at which women would be considered at high risk, and that below which they would then be considered as at low risk. There have been some thresholds that have been used. For example, the HIV guidelines does recommend PrEP for people who are at substantial risk of HIV infection, and substantial risk is then defined by a population level incidence of 3 per 100 person years. But in the current WHO guideline, there is no figure that is attached. This is one of the issues that the guideline development group will be addressing. We are currently doing a review on how this can be addressed in a family planning guideline. One of the issues that will be very important to consider for family planning, because this is a question of individual choice. And when we talk about high risk of HIV infection, we are actually referring to a population characteristic. And we are looking at a population with a certain level of incidence, while the decisions on contraception are very individual. And therefore, when we will define which women will be considered at high risk or at risk of HIV infection, who should be then considered, this is something that we will have to take into account. So at this point, the current guideline is still the same, that this is a decision that is made at the country level and at the program level. WHO does not globally give a number, but it is a question that will be revisited in the next guideline development group. And I can give you, for example, some examples of what this has translated in practice. Some of the countries or some of the programs do consider, for example, commercial sex workers, youth, as particularly as high risk of HIV populations. And for current guidelines, then they apply that recommendation to those populations. But we know that HIV epidemics differ very widely, and even the risk among youth is very different from different countries. So it is something that we'll have to look at in making those recommendations. So currently we are just following the recommendations in the 2017 guideline, where WHO does not define a threshold at which we consider high risk of HIV infection. Thank you.
Great, thank you, James. We'll move to another question for Nancy. Nancy, from your presentation, it appears that many countries, particularly in West Africa, are not prepared, while the results will be announced soon in July. In particularly in countries where use of DMPA is high, how can partners working in the country help support WHO in getting countries prepared for the ECHO results?
Thank you, Nandita. So we have the key steps that we have outlined that are quite important. First of all, we need everyone speaking the same message and giving the same message that we are recommending. And therefore, we need all partners to work with the Ministry of Health and WHO to have a stakeholder meeting so that everybody who is a partner, whether HIV or FP or a stakeholder, has the same message at this time and at the time of the release and post-release. So one of the key steps is to really disseminate to these core stakeholders this what is happening in ECHO and the possible scenarios. The next step that we would like the stakeholders to be quite engaged in is to be part of the task team that is going to oversee the actions prior to and after the release of the ECHO trial results. So each country is supposed to establish this task team and to nominate a focal person who will be speaking on behalf of the team when asked questions, let's say by the media or by any other people about the impact or what these results are saying. We are trying to discourage everybody trying to give reports about the ECHO trial, because already we find in some countries, some people, like James said, there are people who think that the results are there and we just don't want to share them, but we don't have the results at all. And that's why we want a country focal person that has been nominated by this country stakeholder group that is now responsible for the speaking on those issues in each particular country. Also the roadmap, because the roadmap will have specific interventions and activities that have to be done in country, and we know that the ministries of health alone cannot be able to do these things, including training of health workers, producing materials, disseminating them, ensuring contraceptive commodity security, etc., monitoring, supervising. And so all stakeholders need to be on board so that within your jurisdictions, you are all providing that support to the Ministry of Health pre and post the ECHO trial. I think that is just a little of how the stakeholders can engage. The point people right now would be the WHO offices in the country, working in collaboration with the UNFPA and UNAIDS offices, and of course being led by the Ministry of Health teams. Over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. There have been several questions about communication, and Petrus, I'll direct these to you, and you can answer as best as you can. Is WHO preparing some sort of generic communication message as part of the planning for ECHO trial results? And can you talk a little bit more about the scenarios, particularly for high-risk countries before the results are out?
Thank you very much for that question, Andita. Yes, at the moment there are some messaging that is being developed, and as I mentioned, it will be tested or is being tested. So first of all, there's the overarching messages that really should go with everything, despite whatever the trial will show. Such as dual protection and high-risk behavior reduction. Sorry. Then regarding the scenarios, there are quite a lot. So it can be that one of the three methods can be women using that can be at a higher risk than one of the other methods. For instance, DMPA as against to the levonorgestrel implant, or DMPA as against the intrauterine copper device. So it can be on different, it can be the IUD versus DMPA. But there are also some other scenarios that you have to think about. For instance, what James mentioned, there are subgroups as well. Youth, there are different geographical areas. So there are quite a few of those messaging. The messages will be available soon after it has been tested. At the moment, if you are interested in the specific, once again, I did put the link to the ECHO trial there, and the ECHO trial and the WHO RHR. And in that, you will have quite a few resources already. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Petrus. There have been several questions on DMPA sub-Q. So James, maybe I'll address this to you. Given the emphasis on DMPA and sub-Q being rolled out in many countries, how does WHO plan on addressing DMPA sub-Q if the ECHO trial results show evidence of increased risk with users of DMPA IM, given that DMPA sub-Q was not part of the trial, as you said?
So thank you very much for that question. And I think it's really a very important question, not only for DMPA subcutaneous, but also, for example, for etonogestrel implants. As we know, what is in the trial is the levonorgestrel implants, and as opposed to the etonogestrel implant, which is the more commonly used. And also the levonorgestrel IUS that is commonly used, and what we have in the trial is the copper IUD. So there's all these methods, as you know, specifically for DMPA subcutaneous and NET-N. At the last guideline development group, there was a lot of discussion as whether the recommendations should be disaggregated for the different progestin-only injectables, on the understanding that there are different compounds, they have different effects, and for DMPA subcutaneous is the same compound, but it's delivered at a different dosage, and probably the pharmacokinetic levels in the body are different. So this will be put in the previous guideline development group. Just to step back a little bit, it was decided that we did not have sufficient evidence to actually make separate recommendations. As of this time, we do not have much data. We do not have any data on subcutaneous DMPA. I know there's a lot of research that is going on, looking at the blood levels, comparing DMPA IM, and also looking at its impact on the various potential mechanisms by which DMPA IM may increase the risk of HIV transmission. Therefore, this is a question that will be put again to the GDG as to whether they will retain the grouping of DMPA IM, DMPA subcutaneous, and NET-N as progestin-only injectables with similar recommendations regarding increase of HIV infection. And really to emphasize this is if that happens to be the scenario. We are not saying that that is the case, but if that happens to be the scenario, then there will be discussion as to whether these methods should be continue to be grouped together. There's been more data, particularly basic science data that has more come recently, pointing out the differences between the methods, and that will be something that will inform those recommendations. And that is why it is very important that, as I said, that the echo study should not be seen as to the one that will answer all the questions. We have to really view the echo study as additional evidence, but it will be important to look at the evidence comprehensively and holistically in making the decision. So thank you very much for that question. It's really a very important issue that will have to be considered in making the guidelines. Thank you. Over to you, Nandita.
Great. Thank you, James. I think we have time for one more question, and this has come up a couple of times. Much of the preparation for ECHO trial is focused in African countries. Can you talk a little bit about the preparation for results in Asian countries like India or even in Latin America? And I will direct that question to James or Petrus or Nancy.
Thank you, Nandita, for that question. So we have been specifically in touch with our WHO colleagues and also with the Ministry of Health in India to raise awareness of the ECHO study. As you are aware, these countries have very low HIV prevalence, and the numbers of women who are at high risk of HIV is not high, just due to the nature also of the epidemics in these countries. And I think when Petrus did his presentation, he pointed out that in thinking about the messages, we are thinking both about the high prevalence countries where there are many women at high risk of HIV infection, but also we have specific messages that are being developed targeting low prevalence countries where there are not high populations of women at high risk of HIV. So there are methods at both, and we are making sure that across all the countries, there's awareness about the trial and that the ministries are supported and other stakeholders are supported to be able to respond appropriately.
Wonderful. Thank you, James, for that. We've come to our time, so I want to thank all the panelists for your preparation and effort in today's seminar. Thank you to all of our participants for your active engagement and all the questions. We did not get to answer every question, but we tried to answer the ones that generated sort of similar questions. We will be posting this webinar, the recording, on the HRP video library. You can see the link on your screen. And as James and Petrus mentioned, there are lots of efforts around preparing for ECHO. So please keep an eye out, and we will continue to share upcoming webinars, either through IBP or FP 2020 or many other groups that are working together to prepare for the ECHO trial results. So with that, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your days. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.